The name for 24th of January 1962, Part 1 of 4. I sense a certain difficulty in trying to resume where I'm going with you, these subtle light traces, given that yesterday evening I had to explain things in a much more direct way. The important thing for us, for what follows in our seminar, is that even what I said yesterday evening clearly concerns the function of the object, the little a object, within the subject's process of identification, meaning something that is not immediately to hand, that is not going to be resolved straight away, on which yesterday evening I gave, if I may say so, a much anticipated indication by using the theme of the three caskets. This theme of the three caskets sheds a lot of light on my teaching, because if you open what is bizarrely called Essays on Applied Psychoanalysis, and you read the article on the three caskets, you will find that you end up going a little bit hungry. In the end, you don't know very well where he wants to go with it, our father Freud. I think that with what I said yesterday evening, with identifying the three caskets with the demand, a theme that I don't think you've thought about for a long time, which says that in each of these three caskets, without that there wouldn't be a riddle, there wouldn't be a problem. There is the object, little a, insofar as it concerns us, we analysts, but this is not at all necessarily the object that corresponds to the demand. Not at all necessarily its opposite either, because without this there wouldn't be any difficulty. This object is the object of desire. And desire, where is it? It is outside. And there where it truly is, the crucial point, it's you the analyst, insofar as your desire must not be mistaken about the subject's object of desire. If this wasn't the case, there wouldn't be any value in being an analyst. There is one thing that I will tell you in passing, which is that I have all the same put the emphasis in front of a supposedly non-expert audience on something into which here I have perhaps not put my great big hooves in enough, meaning that the system of the unconscious, the system psi, is a partial system. Once again I rejected, evidently with more energy than solid grounding, given that I had to go over it so quickly, the reference to totality, which does not stop us from talking about what is partial. I insisted within this system on its ultra-flat quality, on its surface-like quality, on which Freud insisted all the time with a vengeance. One can be astonished that this has engendered the metaphor of depth psychology. Completely by chance, just now, before coming, I rediscovered a note that I had written on the ego and the id. The ego is above all else a corporeal entity, not only a completely surface entity, but an entity that corresponds to the projection of a surface. All that's for nothing. When people read Freud, they are always reading him in a certain way, which I call the deaf way. Picking up our staff and resuming this peregrine's progress, let's pick up from where we were, where I left you last time, i.e. on the idea that negation, if it is somewhere that is at the heart of our problem, which is that of the subject, it is not immediately, just look at it phenomenologically, the simplest thing to handle. It is all over the place, and then a lot of the time it slips between our fingers. You saw an example last time in a split second in relation to the non nullus non mendax. You saw me put in this non, then take it out, then put it back in. This happens all the time. It was indicated to me in the interim that in the discourse of the one who someone, my poor dear friend Merleau-Ponty, billed as the great man who rules over us, in a discourse pronounced by this so-called great man, we hear, "One cannot not believe that things will happen without mishap." On this exegesis, what does he mean? The interesting thing is not so much what he means to say, it's that we patently understand very well exactly what he means to say, and that if we analyse it logically, we see that he in fact says the opposite. It is a great little formula in which one is constantly slipping by trying to say to someone, "You are not without ignorance of ... It's not you that is wrong. It's the subject's relationship to the signifier that emerges from time to time. It's not simply standard paradoxes, the odd lapsus that I point out in passing. We will rediscover them, these formulae, if we go about it in the right way. And I think I can give you the key to why "you are not without ignorance of" means what you want it to mean. So that you know where you are, I can tell you that it's very much by probing it that we will find its true weight, the true tilt of these scales in which I place before you the neurotic's relationship to the phallic object when I tell you, in order to get hold of this relationship, it must be said that he is not without having it. Clearly, this does not mean that he has it. If he had it, there wouldn't be any doubt about it. In order to get there, let's start again with a little reminder of the phenomenology of our neurotic concerning the point we are on, his relationship with the signifier. For a while now, I have begun to get you to realise that there is something to do with writing, original writing, in the signifier business. It must have come to your mind, all the same, that what the obsessional is always dealing with is essentially this ungeschehen machen, to undo, to make it not have happened. What does that mean? What is it about? Manifestly, it can be seen that in his behaviour, what he wants to extinguish, this is what the annalist writes about throughout his long history, the annalist with two N's in it. It's the annals of the affair that he wants to efface, scratch out, extinguish. From what perspective does the discourse of Lady Macbeth reach us, when she says that all the water in the ocean will not erase this little spot? If this is not in the slightest way an echo that guides us to the heart of our subject. Only there it is, by erasing the signifier, as it is clear that this is what it is about, in her way of doing it, in her way of effacing, in her way of scratching out what is written. What is much less clear to us, since we know a little more about it than others, is what she wants to achieve by this. It's in relation to this that it is enlightening to continue on this road that we are on, which I have brought you on the question of how this becomes a signifier as such. If that has such a fundamental relationship to the subject, if there is no subject thinkable other than as this natural X factor, insofar as it is marked by the signifier, there must all the same be some kind of pushback from this. We're not going to be content with this kind of blindfolded truth. The subject, it is very clear that we have to locate it at the origins of the signifier itself. In order to pull a rabbit out of a hat, this is how I started spreading outrage through my strictly speaking analytic propositions. The poor dear old defunct man, and very touching in his fragility, was literally exasperated by this kind of reminder that I kept making, with a lot of insistence, because at the moment these are useful formulae, that in order to pull a rabbit out of a hat, you have to have put one there beforehand. The same has to apply in relation to the signifier, and that is what justifies this definition of the signifier that I give you, this distinction from the sign, which is that if the sign represents something for someone, the signifier is articulated in a different way. It represents a subject for another signifier. You will find enough confirmation of this at every stage in order to keep you on the straight and narrow. And if it represents the subject thus, how does it do it? Let's go back to the point that we started from, to our sign, at the chosen point where we can grasp it as representing something for someone, in the trace, starting again from the trace, in order to follow our little business of the trace, a step, a trace, the step of Friday on the Isle of Robinson, emotion, the heart beating at the sight of this trace. All this tells us nothing, even if from this beating heart the result is a whole load of trampling around the trace. This can happen at any old intersection of animal tracks. But if, as it happens, I find a trace of this, that someone has endeavoured to erase the trace, or even if I no longer find any trace of this effort, if I have come back because I know, not that I'm any more proud of myself for that I left the trace, that I find that, without anything that would suggest that there was a link between this effacing and a general effacing of this kind of trace, the trace as such has definitely been effaced. Here I am sure that I am dealing with a real subject. Note that, in this disappearance of the trace, what the subject is seeking to make disappear is the passage of her himself as subject. The disappearance is a duplication of the disappearance aimed at, which is the act itself of making disappear. This is not bad as a trace in which we could recognize the passage of the subject when it concerns her-his relationship with the signifier, to the extent that we already know that everything that I teach you about the structure of the subject, such as we try to articulate it on the basis of this relationship with the signifier, converges on the emergence of these moments of fading in English, that are correctly speaking linked to this eclipsed pulsing of what only appears in order to disappear and reappears in order to disappear again. This is the mark of the subject as such. That said, with the erased trace, the subject goes round and around its location in a circle, something that henceforth concerns her, him, like a landmark of the spot where she, he found the trace. Ah well, here you have the birth of the signifier. This implies, this whole process that includes the most recent return on top of the initial trace, that there could not be any articulation of the signifier without these three phases. Once the signifier has been constituted, there are necessarily two previous ones. A signifier, which is a mark, a trace, something written, but it cannot be read on its own. Two signifiers, which is a right muddle, a jump from one thing to another. Three signifiers, which is the return of what it's about, meaning the first one. It's when the pas, meaning step in French, marked by the trace is transformed, in the vocalization of the one who says it, into pas, meaning not in French, that this pas, on condition that it is forgotten that it means a step, can begin to be used in what is called the phonetics of writing to represent not, and, by the same token, eventually to transform the trace de pas into the pas de trace, i.e. the trace of a step, into the not a trace. I think that you can hear in passing the same ambiguity that I made use of when I spoke to you on the subject of jokes, of the pas de sens, meaning nonsense but also no direction, playing on the ambiguity of the word sens with this leap, this crossing over that gets us there to where the gag is born, when we don't know why a word makes us laugh. This subtle transformation, this stone that has been cast aside, that by being picked up again becomes the cornerstone, and I will willingly make the pun with the pi r of the formula of the circle, pronounced PR, meaning stone in French, because it is just as much in this, I declared it to you the other day by introducing the square root of -1, that we will see that the vectorial angle of the subject to the line of the signifying chain is, if I may say so, measured. This is where we are left in suspense, and this is where we ourselves have got to get a bit used to shifting on a substitution by which something that has a meaning is transformed into something equivocal and then rediscovers its meaning.